Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. We're going to be talking about European online marketplace strategy and unauthorized seller enforcement in Europe. I'm Darren Garcia. As Sarah just said, I'm a partner and one of the leaders of the Vorys eControl team. I'm joined today by several colleagues and friends, and I will let them introduce themselves and explain the services that they provide and why they're on the call talking to you today. So go ahead, team.
Hi there, I'm Nicola Hollow here. I'm General Manager of Practicology. We're based in London. We represent Europe. We're a global e-commerce consultancy. We help companies scale across the world. We've got lots of experience helping US brands come into Europe. So we're on the call today to really share some stories that we've experienced about how brands have struggled to get traction in Europe or the things that are not considered before entering these markets. Laura?
I'm Laura Jelowicki, the International Director for Pattern, also based in London. I've been working in international directly with e-commerce marketplaces for almost 15 years. And my role at Pattern and Practicology is to help bring the Pattern model to all of our global regional teams.
And I'm Sarah Long. I'm a partner at Euclid Law. We're a boutique competition law firm with offices in London and Brussels, and we specialise in UK and EU competition law. And we are advising and working alongside Vorys to support the online marketplace strategy and ensure that everything is compliant with competition law. And we have a particular expertise in e-commerce and the digital economy.
So today we're going to focus our comments on how is it that brands can obtain the most effective and lawful controls of their products in Europe and in particular on European marketplaces, the driving force behind the need for these types of changes on the part of brands coming out of the evolution of e-commerce and the growth of online marketplaces and the spread of those marketplaces across Europe. Prior to e-commerce, brands could rely on traditional distribution controls and other largely open type models because disruption of those models or the popping up here or there of somebody selling things in an unauthorized manner or somehow consistent with brands was not particularly disruptive insofar as people really couldn't see it. And now as you have the advent of online marketplaces and all the things that they provide and bring to light in terms of anybody being able to obtain your products, to resell them, dynamic pricing algorithms, the ability to comparison shop super easily, the impact of product reviews, and really the fact that if you don't step in and take steps to impose lawful controls on this channel and people reselling in the channel, it very quickly becomes the tail that wags the dog across your entire business, and it can be very disruptive. And really from the underlying control, as we've seen in the US and are beginning to see spread across Europe, when brands are able to effectuate that, they are then able to attain a number of the very business positive outcomes in terms of growth, in terms of choice, and other things that become very significant and are brought, to light in light of all of the disruption if you don't get it right. So I think I'll turn it over here to Nicola and to Laura just to talk about the growth of third-party marketplaces and how it's expanding across Europe, and then we can get into some of it.
Sure. So in the UK and Europe, we focus on a lot of the work we've done with US companies is helping them enter Europe using the direct-to-consumer website. But over the last couple of years, increasingly, Amazon is obviously coming up as the people on Amazon in the States, and they obviously think of them in Europe. And Amazon is by far the biggest marketplace over here. But there are a wealth of other marketplaces that need to be considered. There are a lot more marketplaces that focus on particular categories, whether that's fashion, electronics, homewares. So depending on the market or the category that you're in and the market you want to enter, it's important to think about what marketplaces are right for you. It's not always Amazon. Most of the time it probably is because of their scale, but it's thinking about the other ones that could also help you grow faster.
And very often brands will use marketplaces as a way to test a market in early entry, and this slide kind of shows the proliferation of marketplaces. But it's really important that when you start on your internationalization plan, if you are going to use a marketplace, to consider what that means for your brand reputation, your brand equity, and how to maximize on your customer base as you're starting to go internationally. So very often what you see is companies using Amazon.com to test it, but they're not necessarily getting some of the localization tactics right, like
Yeah.
tone of voice and product mix, and it's really important to have all sorts of considerations.
So even from US English to English in the UK, there are differences in the way people write, to different words, different meanings, and we localize a lot of content. So we take the US Amazon content for our clients and actually localize it. So how people search on Google, on Amazon, on any of these marketplaces can often be different. So it's important to really understand how your consumers or potential consumers would search for you and then optimize accordingly.
Yeah. Making sure that entry, that propositional entry is correct the first time you go in.
Great.
And also beyond language, there's content, there's promotions, cultural nuances, differences in pricing. In Europe, it's just not one big country, obviously, and there's lots of regulations, different pricing across markets, different taxes and regulations that need to be considered,
Cost to serve, import duties, et cetera, et cetera.
So it doesn't mean you can be put off by it, that it can be quite simple, but it's just important to think about the opportunity first and all of these different things that need to be considered before entry.
And certainly all of those commercial considerations being front and center for brands and thinking about how will you evolve into that as you grow your brand across Europe and the marketplaces at play. And I think that all of your efforts as a brand in those respects will be incredibly enhanced when you have the underlying controls necessary to really reap the benefit of your work on the commercial side. And you know, we'll talk here about the proliferation of third-party resellers. As anybody who's operating in the U.S. knows, you know, if you have open marketplaces and largely uncontrolled distribution, the marketplaces provide fertile ground for third-party resellers to pop up and to cause significant damage to your brand in terms of your brand equity, your consumer experience, the nature of the quality of the product in the channel, et cetera. And they come in all shapes and sizes, from professionals down to, you know, simple hobbyists or people just trying to return something that they don't like. But, you know, as we think about Europe, you know, the number of things that they do in terms of not investing in quality controls, the reviews that they drive, customers getting or consumers getting damaged product, authorized sellers losing incentive to invest in the brand, or, you know, when you're working with a company, you know, Practicology and all the work that they can do for you, being able to really, again, maximize on the value of that and not having a bunch of fly-by-night, low-quality people being able to come in and take from you and free ride off of all of your efforts. So, you know, we believe very, very strongly that companies need to evolve, and we're out promoting that message all the time because we see the difference in working with hundreds of companies between those that are able to establish the necessary controls and account for the realities in these new channels, and those that still try to do things the traditional way and are feeling significant pain as a result of that. And, you know, in the EU, brands are very confused and believe that they have little to no recourse to be able to deal with the phenomenon of unauthorized sellers on marketplaces and the disruption that they're causing. But the reality is that there's a path forward to go ahead and to position your brand for long-term success in the channel. There have been a number of legal developments in the EU that we won't belabor here significantly, but I'll let Sarah give you the highlights just so you understand that, to the extent anybody on the phone has a legal background, that the winds are changing in Europe to recognize the truly unique nature of marketplaces and the disruption that they can cause to brands, and the resulting self-help that the brands can engage in that regard. So Sarah, do you want to talk through that?
Yes, thank you, Darren. So just as taking a step back, I think there has been a sense across Europe that over the last sort of 10 years or so, competition authorities have welcomed the online proliferation of e-commerce because it means that prices are very transparent, and so the consumer gets the lowest price. And gradually what is happening is that there is a recognition now that actually online marketplaces and the digital economy is a very different way of selling and a very different way of doing things than in a brick and mortar environment. And there have been a couple of particular sort of points along the way where we've seen the competition authorities accepting to a certain extent that potentially the traditional views around lowest price being best needs to be challenged. And this sort of started with the e-commerce sector inquiry. That was a very, very detailed inquiry that went out to market, and there was a lot of discussion with brands and with companies operating in the online space, and there was a real recognition there that competition is not just about price, and there's a need to protect quality, brand image and innovation, and there is a need for brands to be able to protect their brand equity in effect. The biggest sort of case, those of you, some of you may be aware of this if you are either have a legal background or are aware of some of the case that's going on over here is the Coty case. And this was quite important because in effect the judgment there said that online marketplace bans, so in effect requiring resellers not to sell on Amazon, can be justified by the product, and if they are applied in a non-discriminatory way. Now that was a luxury product that was being looked at, but there are some messages there which is in effect saying, you know, we need to understand that brands should have the ability to protect the way in which their product is presented online, and in particular an ability for consumers to buy online in the same way that they would buy in a retail environment, and having that brick and mortar experience should be available in an online sort of setting. There's also the vertical block exemption regulation consultation. Now the vertical block exemption regulation is not something I will go into great detail on unless someone wants to ask a question on it, but ultimately this is the framework by which that we will carry out any legal analysis looking at these types of agreements between brands and resellers. And there is a consultation at the moment which is looking really at what works, what does not work, and particularly focusing on those aspects which don't work for online marketplaces and digital economy. So that's currently going on at the moment. There's also been 2 reports, one in the UK and one in the EU, focused specifically around digital markets and looking at the ways in which the current framework works and the ways in which it doesn't. So that's just a kind of potted history of what's going on, really to give a flavour of the fact that currently in Europe there is a real understanding, in a sense, that brands need to be able to take the steps necessary to protect their brand equity online, but also recognition that the legal framework as it stands is quite difficult to manoeuvre. And so what we are trying to do is explain that there is a way forward, and there is a way forward that it works within the current legal framework.
Great. So in terms of protecting and growing your brand in the marketplace era in Europe, you know, there are 3 key steps, and I think that it's for the people on the call familiar with the U.S., might be illustrative to compare and contrast the 2 regimes at play. You know, in the U.S., you can, as typically as a brand or manufacturer, dictate who can resell your products, where they're able to sell them. You know, you can define what lanes and channels they're able to operate in, and you can do this all rather easily and really without regard for much in terms of market impacts and things like that, as long as you're talking about a vertical sense, meaning downstream as opposed to horizontally. And if you don't like somebody, you know, you can strip them of their authorized status, stop supplying them, etc. You can also do things like MAP policies or minimum resale price policies. And, you know, there are differences that you just need to account for on the very front end in Europe, insofar as things like MAP policies and minimum resale price policies we'll touch on later are just not allowed. And you also have to be very deliberate in setting up your distribution strategies if you want the ability to have any say or control into how your products are being disseminated downstream. And you know, you can put yourself in a position where you have control, but you have to do it in a different and more planned out on the front end way in Europe. So let's talk about that and contrast that to some of the experiences in the U.S. So first, you know, you need to determine your online go-to-market strategy. Okay, and this is similar to an analysis a brand would undertake in the U.S., but you need to be very, again, thoughtful on the front end. And that's not to say that if the cat's already out of the bag and you're not already sort of engaged, that there's no hope for you. There absolutely is. But when you sit down to undertake this process, you will want to have thought these things through and then be able to execute around an aligned upon strategy in your organization. So this is where you sit there and you decide, okay, are we going to sell first party to Amazon? Are we going to sell as our own third party? Are we going to sell to an exclusive third party seller like Pattern Practicology, who's on the phone, some type of hybrid model if that's available to you, an other model, and really begin to ask yourself the questions that, as a brand, will it be important to limit the number of resellers on an Amazon, for example, or other marketplace to those players that are going to be very invested in your brand, very high quality? Is that a particular import that these fly-by-night type resellers aren't able to get a hold of your product and sell them without any oversight? Do you want to engage in some type of exclusivity in the online channel, or will it be a wider distribution type model? And what are the existing commercial relationships that you have, and how will they be impacted by this, and how can your marketplace strategy be laid on top of those relationships without causing any significant disruption of them? So, getting clarity on these steps first will really help to inform the next step. So, the traditional Amazon distribution models here, we won't spend much time on them, but deciding where you want to fall on this spectrum will inform, again, the foundational things that you need to put in place. And it's important at this stage to really understand, okay, how are you going to enforce against unauthorized third-party sellers that might pop up and disrupt your strategy? Because you're going to have effectively two main vehicles through which to do that. The first being a trademark claim, and this is only available typically if it is product that's showing up in Europe that's originating from someplace outside of the European Economic Area. But if it is product that you're directing into Europe intentionally, your company's directing into Europe intentionally, and is intended that it be there, those types of claims go out the window for you. They still are viable, certainly in the U.S., but Europe's a different market in terms of its intellectual property law. So that leaves most brands who have directed product into Europe intentionally and still would like to be able to have a vehicle through which to stop unauthorized resale of their product, need to rely on something called selective distribution. So this is a concept that's been around for a long time. We'll talk more about it. But when you have this in place, it really can be the one tool to give you the ability, again, to go out and enforce against those unauthorized sellers. So if that's a current issue for your brands in Europe, or has been in the U.S. and you're afraid that it's going to be over there, or perceive that it will be over there, you really need to start thinking about how can we get a form of selective distribution lawfully implemented for our products. And so, let's talk about, designing and implementing your marketplace distribution. So how do you design the foundation around the strategy that you want to support? So I think the first decision point here is, do you want to consider a form of selective or exclusive distribution? And these will all depend on various levels of granular inquiry for your organizations, but as a macro matter, selective distribution is where you're selling through a select group of distributors and retailers that meet certain criteria, and those that are outside of your select group can be precluded from selling your product, okay? Or a form of exclusive distribution wherein you anoint an exclusive distributor in Europe or in a particular channel, and again, you have to satisfy certain criteria to be able to do that, but it can be a very effective way to achieve control as well. So as you are going through this, Sarah, do you want to give Sarah's the in-country expert on, or the Europe expert on selective distribution on the phone here. So do you want to give just an overview of the concept and give them a little background on it?
Yes, that would be great. Thank you, Darren. Some of you may well be aware of this or have some experience of it. Some of you will potentially not have heard of it at all, so I'll try and sort of keep it high level but with enough detail. So yeah, in effect, selective distribution allows you to select those companies and resellers who will distribute your product. So it is a select kind of ecosystem, I often say, and the rules are that those within the selective distribution system will then need to abide by a set of criteria which is relevant to the particular product, which is or range of products or entire range of products, depending on what you would choose, and that criteria would then inform who would be able to sell that product. Authorized sellers must then be able to sell to any end users or other authorized sellers within that selective distribution ecosystem, but importantly not to unauthorized sellers. Now, selective distribution has traditionally been employed by luxury brands, so the very high-end brands that you just don't see online at all have had sort of selective distribution in for decades and decades. So it is not, importantly, a new concept. But what is very different is that whereas previously selective distribution was used by brands who wanted to have a particular type of brick and mortar store and maybe particular experts to sell the product that they had, be that because it was a luxury cosmetic product or some form of luxury fashion item, or because it was some form of nutritional supplement or something like that. So there would be a variety of different reasons as to why they might have wanted to have some form of selective distribution. But what is increasingly happening now is a wider variety of sort of select brands, so those brands who have products that would be able to justify selective distribution, are beginning to realize that this is the most efficient way and the only way really to ensure some form of control over who sells their products. And ultimately what it means is that you take qualitative and quantitative criteria, which we'll go on to discuss in a bit more detail, to ensure that those resellers selling your product are of a sufficient high quality to sell that product in the way that is appropriate. And of course it will be completely different depending on what product you're selling, on how you want to sell it. So the criteria, importantly, is not something that we would just refer to. It's not something that competition authorities set out. It's an entirely bespoke process that takes place with us sort of sitting down and talking to you about what would be appropriate in any sort of circumstance, and then identifying as a result of that criteria which resellers would be the right ones to sell your product.
Great, thank you. So so just to level set here again, I mean, we're talking about what is a type of distribution architecture and surrounding legal regime that brands can put in place to be able to effectively deal with unauthorized sellers and to have the appropriate resellers selling their product in this new marketplace era. And certainly as marketplaces have advanced in terms of their penetration of the market and have grown, the need for brands all up and down the spectrum, for any quality brand to be able to step in and inform what are the criteria that somebody reselling my product is going to have to meet has become incredibly important, because even if you're selling, some type of mass market quality product, you simply can't have a situation where people are pumping poor quality product into online marketplace channels and consumers are receiving that product and then turning around and leaving negative product reviews, killing you in your search, and other sort of algorithmically impactful ways. It's just become a reality for any brand of any type of level of nice quality brand to be able to step in and say, hey, in the marketplace channel in particular, there are certain criteria that you need to meet to be able to sell my product. So how do you get these things designed and implemented? And it's a multi-step process, beginning with just deciding which is the best model for your product and brand. So is it a selective model? Is it an exclusive model? What are the commercial outcomes you're trying to drive towards? What are the nature of resellers you want to support? What type of brand equity do you have that you're trying to maintain, et cetera? And then it's a matter of studying and documenting market shares and competitive conditions, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But basically, the higher you go up in market share, the more restricted you're going to be in the types of criteria that you can implement to define the types of resellers that can sell your product. Conversely, the lower your market share, the more leeway you're going to have to do that, provided that it's objectively justifiable for your brand. Which, given the perils of marketplaces as they are today, there's going to be a number of rather, significant quality measures that can be imposed by most brands relative to the nature of quality of reseller in the marketplace channel, just because everybody can be harmed by the factors that play there. And number 3, determine the appropriate criteria that are going to support the strategy that you have. So, brands that are selling to Amazon or selling through an exclusive third-party seller like a Pattern, for example, you want your sales going to your authorized seller that you know that you are partnered with, that you have a relationship with, that's doing things to invest in your brand, and that is meeting the types of quality standards that you expect. And 4, you want to think about, okay, what are my main channels? Do I have offline? I have online. And then in particular with respect to online, marketplace. And then what are the unique commercial, distribution, fulfillment, and threat realities in each of those channels, and how do you design criteria that are appropriate for them? Because things that may have been appropriate in the brick and mortar days, up to 10 years ago, really are either irrelevant or just not an issue in the online channel and the marketplace channel, and vice versa. So brands now have to account for the realities of these channels and create these criteria that are going to speak to them. And then it comes down to getting the contracts or policies out with your authorized resellers, saying, hey, these are our criteria. And as new sellers raise their hand seeking to resell your product, being able to vet them and determine whether they in fact do meet your criteria and are able to sell. And the goal for brands in setting this type of thing up is not to go in and destroy your existing relationships or to cut people off or things like that. It is simply to define what are the qualities and the nature of those reselling your products, and to build those criteria around that. And frankly, a lot of your good, mainline distribution customers, your brick and mortar customers, are going to satisfy the criteria. They've been established partners for a long time, and they may not satisfy them in marketplace, for example. But there's I don't necessarily know that you want them to. But again, the goal is not to be disruptive, but simply to state what those criteria are, and to do it in a way that's justifiable and lawful. And in a way that's going to allow you to exclude those that would damage your brand. And this really is the path forward in Europe. So we will, in the interest of time, not get too granular, but it begins, with a brand product market analysis. So really deciding, okay, what are our market shares? Where do we fall? The kind of the magic threshold is 30%. So if you are below that threshold, you're going to have a wider array of criteria, both qualitative and quantitative, available for you if your products are otherwise suitable. And as you go above that market share, you're going to be, assuming again products are suitable, and most products at some level are suitable for some type of quality standard, but living mostly in that quality camp as opposed to quantitative, because of the way the competition laws work in Europe. You can't do things typically from a quantitative perspective above the 30% market share threshold. So that's an important first step, and just something, again, that, in working with companies is just a baseline thing that we look at. And now you get into the criteria selection process. So again, we've talked a lot about qualitative, quantitative criteria. Qualitative being criteria that are likely justified for most products and most brands because they speak to the quality expectations of resellers and the treatment of your product and the presentation of your brand. And you can get into quantitative criteria, if appropriate, that these are the types of criteria that more directly limit the number of resellers, say, for example, or the quantities that an authorized reseller would need to purchase from you or sell for you, et cetera. So these, we can go into a little bit more detail about some baseline qualitative criteria. So there does still need to be, as Sarah mentioned, that bespoke look at each brand, but likely that these types of criteria would be able to be justified for most brands. So, seller history and experience, disclosing product sources, no commingling of inventory in marketplace warehouses, various integrity checks along the way, shipping and handling rules, etc. And you can see even as you're likely considering these types of criteria that the average run-of-the-mill third-party reseller online on a marketplace might not be able to meet these. And so even at the baseline level, you're taking steps to be able to have a mechanism through which to preclude those types of low-quality resellers that would be very damaging to the brand when they're allowed to proliferate. As you move up the spectrum in terms of more heightened qualitative controls, if these are objective and necessary for your product or your brand, you can get into product-specific quality controls. So do you have certain products that have various life cycle or temperature storage requirements, or do they need to be stored in a particular type of facility? Do they require certain types of post-sale support or anything like that? On down to carrying your full product range, participating in your brand programs, paying for their fair share of marketing, et cetera. So, again, as it becomes, as your products are of a nature that these types of things can be reasonably justified, you can consider these also in the qualitative sense. And again, the low quality resellers are just not going to be able to meet these by and large. From a quantitative perspective, again, if appropriate, okay, you can begin to look at things that directly limit the potential number of dealers, resellers, online resellers, minimum order quantities, inventory, sales, etc. And again, these all are fleshed out in the process of studying your brand and really settling in on what is legally viable for you in light of your brand and the products at issue and market shares and things like that. So, just one thing to keep in mind as you're looking to regulate online sales, you can't. The criteria from marketplace to online to brick and mortar, needs to be conceptually consistent. Now, there are certainly nuances in each channel that, for example, on Amazon you have seller defect scores or seller ratings or commingling of inventory and things like that maybe aren't applicable in brick and mortar. But you wouldn't want to have a situation where you have an online criteria that bears no relationship to anything in brick and mortar. So I use an example, a silly example, but you can't say, on the online channel, all my products need to be sold by people that have, green and white websites or something like that, when you have no similar type of criteria in your brick and mortar channel. So again, you can account for the realities in each channel, but you don't want to be totally inconsistent and impose things that would just be, inherently discriminatory against online sellers. So keeping those things in mind, and then again about things like MAP policies and MRP policies, you can't go there in Europe. They're not permitted. They're not legal. And various other hardcore restrictions. These are lines that, as a brand, legally you do not want to cross and be in violation of. So no outright online sales bans or discrimination if it's appropriate for your products. In your strategy, you might be able to consider some type of marketplace ban, so like an Amazon ban or other marketplace bans, again, if appropriate upon examination, but simply banning online sales or discriminating against online sellers not allowed. And same with, if you have selective distribution, set up restrictions on authorized sellers in the network. They need to be able to sell freely between and among themselves and down to end users. So those hardcore restrictions, again, things that legally you do not want to run afoul of, and with the assistance of counsel would keep you out of those types of problems. In terms of implementing selective distribution, there's a very distinct and best practice process here in terms of going out and communicating with your channels about why you're doing this and the benefits of it, the internal training of your employees to make sure that they don't run afoul of anything, the counseling and counseling on and vetting existing or potential resellers. So, when companies come in or resellers come in and want to apply to sell your product, how are we going to go about vetting them to see that they meet our criteria, et cetera? Rolling out the communication to the market about your expectations and your criteria. And then we'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute, but engaging in soft enforcement and escalated enforcement as needed and appropriate. So, very, very briefly, you have exclusive distribution and agency as other models that might be appropriate to go to market in Europe. Being able to name exclusive distribution, particularly for new product rollouts, or if you're entering Europe for the first time, you can look to potentially some type of exclusive distribution relationship and then transition to selective distribution as time passes, or some type of agency model whereby the brand is distributing through a named agent who is effectively acting as the brand itself as far as the law is concerned anyway. So we can talk offline, or if anybody has any particular questions on exclusive distribution, it might be effective in the online channel as well to be able to name, if appropriate, an exclusive, say, Amazon distributor, if it's appropriate for your type of product, etc. These strategies, I don't want to downplay them, but I also don't want to get bogged down and throw too much at everybody. But ask any questions you have about this, because they can be particularly effective. So now let's talk a little bit about enforcement for a bit, and then we can open it up to questions or dive back into anything that anybody would like to in any greater detail. From an enforcement perspective, this is, now you have your strategy, you have the right foundation in place, and how do you go about enforcing against anybody who might otherwise disrupt everything that you've implemented. So your first step in that process is to determine, is this an authorized reseller of my product? If it is, okay, then it's going to be somebody that's selling cross-channel in violation of the terms that they're allowed to sell your product. So maybe somebody who's qualified to sell brick and mortar is turning around and selling online. And there you have the ability to conduct any necessary business enforcements as simply, a conversation or some type of business penalty, and then ultimately any as-needed legal enforcement if that were to become necessary. That's probably going to be the, not infrequent, but the more traditional or clear path forward for most brands that will grasp that. If the seller is not authorized, okay, your first level of inquiry are the products changed, impaired, or from outside of Europe. So again, going back to that concept that if things are coming from outside of Europe, if they're flowing from the U.S. into the Europe market, or China or some other place, and showing up on European online marketplaces, you can still have your intellectual property claims that companies will be familiar with and brands will be familiar with. If that is not the case, okay, so this is product that has been directed by your brands into Europe intentionally and sold there, then your one recourse is selective distribution, okay? And it's just important, I think we framed this up at the beginning, which was, how are you going to enforce against unauthorized sellers? And the reason being that's so important is because, again, if you have a situation where your products are going into the market intentionally, really your only recourse under current law is to have a lawful selective distribution system in place and be able to implement that. Okay, so without that, you're going to be in sort of the proverbial Wild West format, where people or resellers of all shapes and sizes, quality levels, et cetera, anybody that's able to get a hold of your product is going to be selling out there largely uncontrolled and running amok. And for those of you in the U.S. know, if your brands have experienced that and you're working with us or somebody else to deal with that, you know the pain that can cause your business very quickly. So we're trying to get out in front of that here. So, if you do have the trademark type claims available to you, okay, you can engage basically in this type of workflow, pursuant to which, you go out, you identify the unauthorized sellers, see who it is behind the storefront. You can begin with a C&D letter that sets forth your trademark claims and explains why exhaustion doctrine doesn't apply. That's, again, the doctrine that speaks to product that has been directed into the market. You say, look, as a brand, we've never directed this product intentionally into the European Economic Area. Therefore, we've not exhausted our intellectual property rights, and we have intellectual property claims against you. Okay, and then it's just a matter of going and leveraging those against the reseller, and there are, you want to pick the jurisdiction most favorable to you, et cetera. But that's the trademark workflow, and I'm happy to talk about that in any greater detail that anybody would like. But this is generally fairly well understood in the market. So now, though, let's assume that you have a situation, you have your marketplace strategy set up, you know how you're selling, and you have your appropriate legal foundation in place with your selective distribution criteria, and now somebody shows up and is selling outside of your network and causing you disruption in terms of sales or your brand equity, not meeting your criteria, all of those sorts of parade of horribles that these unauthorized resellers cause. So you work the selective distribution workflow then. So same thing as the trademark. You want to identify the unauthorized sellers and the products that they're selling, and the monitoring technology today does that. Pattern Practicology, who are joining us today on the phone, are the top, third-party reseller out there, and they have a software within their company that is very effective at this. But once you're selling online, the software will pick you up, and now you as a brand can determine, okay, do I know this reseller? Are they within my authorized selling network? And go about the identification, if they are, of their product sources, and then be able to take any appropriate business enforcement or cut off their sources, et cetera. So, again, this is a situation, somebody's shown up online, you can tie them to one of your authorized resellers, and now you can deal with that business to business. Now, let's say that, for example, you don't know who they are. This is where you would go out in that soft enforcement mechanism that we talked about and say, hey, I don't recognize you as part of my network. I have selective distribution in place. Here are the criteria to be able to sell my products on an online marketplace. Can you certify that you meet them and allow me to verify that? And they will, if they do so and they don't meet your criteria, you can exclude them. If they lie and you catch them, you have recourse. And importantly as well, if they do meet your criteria, then you need to allow them to sell and allow them into your selective distribution model. That's very different than it is in the U.S., where you can just decide whether you subjectively believe that somebody is appropriate for your brand and have a lot more discretion in that regard. But here, if they meet the criteria, you're going to be required to let them in. If they don't, okay, and they continue to resell, then you can begin a legal enforcement process. So without selective distribution in place, you would basically not be able to take these additional steps. So this is where you can begin that enforcement process, go out with a C&D letter, typically under some form of national tortious interference law or unfair competition law. There's a few of the applicable laws in the large European countries here laid out on the slide, but it's just a matter of understanding, okay, where is the seller, where is jurisdiction appropriate, and what is the applicable legal overlay for the conduct at issue. But you can leverage that through your C&D letter, and then to the extent that they don't come down, you can take escalated legal enforcement as needed, whether that's sending draft pleadings, informing them that you would proceed with some type of court action if they did not comply, all the way up through you would be armed as needed to commence some type of litigation or court action if that ever again became necessary. So that is kind of a high-level overview of what a workflow would look like when you have the appropriate foundation in place. And then, as a brand, you'd be able to really measure and drive key metrics. So sales volume, sales going to authorized sellers, how are your customer reviews trending, the number of unauthorized sellers going down, the seller compliance with your selective distribution criteria, and really, each of these things today being very important in terms of moving forward the business in the e-commerce channel and then the broader omni-channel implications of that from a stability standpoint. And then just sort of in conclusion here, when you think about Europe and where it sits on the spectrum of competition law rigor and the vehicles that brands have available to them, getting the right strategy in place in Europe can really become a bookend for your global strategy because if you can satisfy requirements legally and regulatorily in Europe, you are almost certainly going to be able to satisfy them in any other jurisdiction in the world. And so everybody's going to follow every geo in terms of the legal and regulatory overlay is going to fall somewhere between the U.S. and Europe in terms of what brands can do. So you can really modularize this as appropriate around the world and coordinate effectively. Brands always ask me, where do I think all this is heading? And I think that realistically within the next couple of years, we're not going to be able to probably meaningfully have a very significant call just on the U.S. or just on Europe, but it's going to be what is our global brand control strategy for our products, because it is so intertwined, and you have Amazon 1P now largely sending products anywhere in the world once they have them, and brands really scrambling to understand how does this all fit together globally. And so the Europe strategy, again, is something that once you satisfy that, you're going to be able to modularize that in the other countries in which you're operating in, and nobody's going to be quite as strict as they are in Europe. So again, just to finalize here, and then I'll open it up to any questions or for any additional comments from my counterparts on the phone. The three-step process for obtaining lawful control in Europe. Number one, again, that strategy, determining your go-to-market strategy, understanding the necessary enforcement you're going to have to be able to do, looking at your brands, your products, your market shares, and making sure that from a competitive standpoint, you're not running afoul of any laws, and then obtaining key stakeholder alignment and having everybody buy in internally that doing this is going to be very critical for our brand. And those of you who have gotten this under control in the U.S. know that when you get committed as an organization, you can really drive some significant positive business results from these types of programs. And secondarily, the foundation, getting that in place, determining some type of exclusive distribution, selective distribution, or other model that's going to best support your strategy, getting the necessary foundational policies, contracts, et cetera, drafted, getting those rolled out, and then vetting potential resellers as they apply. And then finally, from an enforcement perspective, having a scalable, efficient, effective enforcement system set up that will allow you then to go out and deal in an escalating way against anybody that would be disrupting the things that you put in place in your brand. So I will stop talking there. If Sarah missed anything, or Nicola or Laura, anything you'd like to add, and then certainly any questions we're all happy to address. Sarah Jolly, if there are questions on there, I'm having trouble seeing them. Oh, here we go. Sarah Long, can you see some of these?
I don't have those on my screen, actually.
Okay. I think if you go to presenter view.
Do you want me to read them out?
So I have it. So somebody's asked, can we prohibit an authorized reseller who's selling a third-party website in our agreement? And the answer is, you can set criteria that allow you to define the nature of authorized reseller that you would allow to sell on a third-party website, and anybody that doesn't meet those criteria you can exclude. So effectively you can prohibit non-qualifying authorized resellers from selling your products. Now that's assuming that you do want to engage with the marketplace channel. If your products are appropriate for an online marketplace ban, so you don't want, say, for example, your products on Amazon, and that's appropriate legally for your product, then you can take those steps to prohibit that type of activity. Let's see. Sarah Long, are you in here now?
I don't have access to the questions,
Okay, if you hit presenter
of which I'm sure there are many.
if you hit the presenter view at the top, there's a little set of icons that the one says presenter view. So
Okay, let me have a look.
somebody asked whether marketplace quality controls can be used for sub 30% market share product lines. You know, there is a significant list of potential quality controls that can be used in those types of situations. I mean, let's just assume that at a baseline that it's, legally appropriate to do so. Things from, you're going to have a particular type of inspection of our product. You're going to have been trained by our quality control people to watch out for particular points of failure. You're going to provide us with your defect score, with your seller ratings every month, and we're going to be able to conduct inspections of your facilities to make sure that they're up to standard. To be able to have to carry a brand's full product line for the best consumer experience. Really a great number of things from a qualitative perspective you can do to speak to, qualitative issues that are unique to the marketplace. I mentioned commingling of inventory. The general understanding is that Amazon will commingle third-party inventory unless the reseller expressly opts out by placing a particular sticker on the product, etc. And you can make those types of requirements so that you have the ability to understand the flow of inventory through marketplace warehouses and things of that nature. So those are just
if I can,
yeah.
I was just going to jump in on the 30% because I think one of the important things to mention is that we talk about this 30% threshold because under the vertical block exemption regulation, there's a safe harbour. So if the brand and the resale on the procurement market are below 30%, then it is assumed that any qualitative or quantitative criteria are not problematic. And that is on the basis that there would be sufficient inter-brand competition, so competition between the brands, to counteract the fact that you're to counteract the effect of restricting competition at an intra-brand level, because of course selective distribution is effectively restricting competition between retailers. But if you're below 30%, then the view is, well, the effect on competition is limited because a consumer can simply choose to go with an alternative brand because there's enough choice at that level. Above 30%, it doesn't mean that you can't impose selective distribution or have some form of qualitative criteria. And in fact, provided that it's justifiable, proportionate and objectively acceptable, then even if you have a much higher market share, you would be able to put in place selective distribution. It's just that's a useful threshold because so many brands actually are below 30% that it's a nice way of being able to say, well, at that level, you've got a lot more commercial freedom. And then above that, you would need to just have a think about any potential ramifications on competition as a whole.
Right. Somebody else asked, can you have a selective distribution for a part of your brand's offer, not the whole brand portfolio? The answer is absolutely. You want products on selective distribution that are appropriate for selective distribution, and I think it's probably best if you have a particular segment of your product line that is not appropriate for selective distribution. That might be some highly commoditized product out in the market that it's more of a pure volume type play for your company. Then yeah, you wouldn't. That might be something that you would want to exclude from the selective distribution criteria.
And just to follow up with that, I mean, that sort of hits the nail on the head, actually, in terms of strategy, because when we advise companies at the very beginning, what will often happen is sitting down and having a very detailed conversation about the strategy of their brand going forward, and what it may mean, sometimes completely dependent on the product that you have. is that selective distribution will be appropriate for certain lines, but not all lines. So commoditized products that you might sell to a wholesaler might be less suitable for selective distribution, but then you might have a premium range that you want to put through selective distribution. And that is absolutely the approach that many, many companies take actually, which is using selective distribution for just some, or even creating a new line of products, and they then are very concerned about protecting that new line, and they will say, well, no, we don't want to restrict resellers at all for any of our existing products, but we've now got this new product. What can we do to protect this particular product?
So, Sarah, here's one that would be probably good for you to address. It said, somebody asked, well, just quoting, they said, I think you just said that if appropriate for our product, we could potentially name one distributor or reseller as the exclusive reseller for Amazon. Is that true? Do you want to take that on?
Yeah, so this is the golden. This is the golden question, and my unhelpful answer is it depends. But I think in principle, I don't feel uncomfortable at the idea that if you had at a certain market share, so below 30%, I think ideally, then if you were to decide that for a particular line of product, let's just go through the assumptions that that product is suitable for selective distribution, and the nature of that product is such that you need to have a particularly high quality reseller reselling it. And that might be because for whatever reason, when you buy the product in store, you might have someone that you can speak to about it. And you obviously wouldn't have that in an online space normally, but potentially you might want to have that as an offering to the customer. Then having an exclusive relationship with a sort of premium reseller who is able to sell that product in the way in which it is appropriate for that product to be sold, I think could be possible. And again, this is all it would be very based on a particular assessment of that market and that product. But ultimately what it will come down to is if as a customer you go on to Amazon and there is sufficient inter-brand competition, meaning that if you don't want to buy that product for whatever reason, you have alternative options to go to, then the restriction that you're putting in place is less problematic from a competition law perspective. That's kind of looking at it quite theoretically. So I think in principle, and this is something that people ask us all the time, I think in principle we think it could be done. Again, whether it would work for your company would be very dependent on the specific circumstances around the product and the market and the particular criteria that are appropriate.
Great. Well, we're out of time. There's a huge list of questions. We're happy to take this offline with anybody that would like to reach out to Sarah or to me and get your questions addressed directly with you. But Sarah Jolly, do you want, in the interest of staying on schedule here, do you want to walk us out?
Yes, this will go ahead and conclude our program. We'll reach out to anyone that has specific questions, and we will be following up with you with the recording of the webinar within a business day. Thank you all for joining us today.
Thanks all.
Thank you.